The courtroom was eerily silent as Frank sat, his gnarled hands resting on the table in front of him. His weathered face, lined with the marks of time, seemed almost like a mask, stoic, unreadable. His eyes, however, were sharp as ever. He wasn't fazed by the crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. To them, he was just another elderly man, probably out of his depth. They didn't know who he really was, or what he had done. The judge, on the other hand, was the first to speak, breaking the silence that had hung thick in the air. "Mr. Franklin," Judge Bennett began, his voice dripping with condescension, "can you even understand the proceedings here today?" Frank didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his lifetime, even from people who claimed to know better. His attorney, a younger woman named Rachel, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had warned Frank about this very moment. The judge wasn't known for his kindness, but Frank hadn't expected to be treated like this. Frank had been a brilliant scientist in his youth, contributing to innovations that changed the course of history in fields no one had ever expected him to be involved in. Yet, now he was here, facing an uphill battle in a courtroom where his genius was mocked and questioned. He couldn't help but wonder, had it all been worth it? Was he just a forgotten relic of a bygone era? "You'll forgive me, Your Honor," Frank's attorney said, her voice firm. "But I must insist that we proceed fairly. Mr. Franklin has every right to be here, and to defend his intellectual property." The judge's eyes flickered with irritation. He looked down at Frank, his gaze cold. "Intellectual property? You're talking about a man who hasn't been relevant in over 2 decades, Ms. Carson. His patents, his so-called discoveries, are ancient. Just like him." A murmur rippled through the room as the audience exchanged uncomfortable glances. Frank didn't respond to the judge's provocation. Instead, he simply looked at the floor, his mind sharp as ever, running through the series of events that had led him to this moment. Frank had spent years hiding from the spotlight, but the truth was, he had a legacy, one that could change the world once again. Years ago, he had invented a groundbreaking technology, something so advanced that even the brightest minds of his generation couldn't quite grasp its full potential. But over the years, it had been stolen from him, manipulated by corporate greed and misplaced ambition. And now, the very company that had profited off his work was trying to claim it as their own. "Mr. Franklin," the judge continued, "do you really think anyone is going to take your claim seriously?" Frank's lips curled into a faint smile, though no one in the room could see it. He had been through much worse than this. He had fought harder battles in the past, some of which he had won. This was just another test of his resolve. At that moment, the doors to the courtroom opened, and a figure walked in, causing a ripple of shock to pass through the room. Clint Eastwood, yes, the Clint Eastwood, stepped into the space, his presence undeniable. His gray hair and piercing blue eyes were as iconic as his career. People whispered in the seats, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was Clint Eastwood in a courtroom, standing right behind Frank Franklin? "Your Honor," Clint's voice boomed, steady and commanding, "I'm here to testify on behalf of my friend, Mr. Franklin." The judge's expression faltered for just a moment, the coldness of his demeanor slipping for a second as he processed the unexpected turn of events. Clint Eastwood, who had been Frank's old friend and colleague back in the day, was an undeniable force in his own right. But why was Clint here now, and why was he putting himself in the middle of this mess? The room was now in chaos, with murmurs and shocked whispers filling the space. No one could quite grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Bennett began, his tone slightly more reserved, "I'm sure you have better things to do than involve yourself in this debacle." Clint chuckled softly, undeterred by the judge's snark. "I don't think you understand, Your Honor," he said, his voice full of quiet authority. "This debacle, as you put it, is more than just a legal matter. It's a matter of history. And Frank Franklin is a man who deserves better than this mockery." Frank raised his head slightly, his heart swelling with a sense of gratitude. Clint had always been there for him, even when the world had turned its back. But Frank was also puzzled. Why was Clint doing this now? It had been so long since they had spoken, let alone shared a moment like this. Clint continued, speaking directly to the judge. I've known Frank for decades. I've seen his work firsthand. What you're mocking here today is not some has-been or irrelevant individual. Frank Franklin is a genius. And those patents you think are so old. They're not. They're just ahead of their time. The judge looked taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. Genius? Is that what you're calling him? A man who hasn't stepped foot in a lab in years. Frank could feel the tension in the room building, but something in Clint's voice, steady, unwavering, reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that there were still people in the world who saw him for who he truly was, not just the aging figure sitting before the court. Judge, Clint said with a hint of authority, sometimes, the greatest minds take time to reflect, to retreat, to step away from the chaos. But that doesn't mean their work is any less significant. Frank Franklin's contributions to science are monumental, and I think it's time you recognize that. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly annoyed, but he couldn't shake the weight of Clint's words. For a brief moment, Frank saw a flicker of doubt in the judge's eyes. This was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Franklin was a man of many contradictions. To the outside world, he appeared to be a frail old man who had long faded from the spotlight. But beneath that worn exterior was a mind that had once shaped the future of science, and even now, in his twilight years, he possessed a brilliance that few could fathom. At the age of 78, Frank had long left the limelight behind. He lived alone in a small, modest house tucked away on the outskirts of a sleepy town in Northern California. Most days, he sat by the window, looking out at the sprawling hills, reflecting on a life that had been full of triumphs and tragedies. His body was no longer as agile as it once had been, but his mind was still as sharp as ever. Frank had never been one for attention. He was a man who preferred solitude to the chaos of fame and recognition. In his prime, he had been a leading figure in the scientific community, a pioneer in the field of renewable energy. His breakthrough invention, an energy-efficient solar cell, had the potential to revolutionize the world. But despite its immense promise, the technology had been suppressed, stolen by corporate giants who were more interested in their own profits than the future of humanity. It was this theft that had driven Frank into seclusion. He had watched as his life's work was twisted and repurposed by those who had no understanding of its true potential. He had spent years trying to reclaim his creation, but the world had moved on. And so, Frank retreated from the world, seeking solace in the quiet of his home, surrounded by the pages of his notebooks and the echoes of his past. But even in his retreat, Frank was not forgotten. He had one person in the world who never gave up on him, his daughter, Lucy. Lucy was Frank's only child, and she had always been his anchor. Growing up, she had seen the brilliance of her father, but also the toll that his work had taken on him. He had poured himself into his inventions, often at the expense of his family life. But Lucy understood. She had seen firsthand the passion and dedication that fueled him, and she admired him for it. After Frank's wife, Lucy's mother, passed away, Frank became even more withdrawn. Lucy had tried to reach out to him, but he had distanced himself. It was only in recent years that they had begun to reconnect, though Frank still found it difficult to talk about the past. Lucy knew her father's genius, but she also knew the pain it had caused him. Now, as Frank sat in the courtroom, Lucy's thoughts were with him. She had been in the back of the room, watching with a mixture of pride and anxiety as the trial unfolded. She had always believed in her father's work, but the world had never truly understood him. And now, she was watching him face the mockery of the very system that had wronged him. She remembered the day she first heard about the lawsuit. It had been years since Frank had even mentioned his invention, but one fateful day, a letter arrived in the mail. The letter was from a major tech company, claiming ownership of the patent that Frank had filed decades ago. The company had taken the technology and used it to build a multi-million-dollar empire, all while giving no credit to the man who had created it. Lucy knew that this was her father's last chance to get the recognition he deserved. She had urged him to fight, but Frank had been reluctant. He had grown tired of the fight, tired of the system that had failed him. But Lucy wouldn't give up. She couldn't stand to see her father's legacy erased, so she had convinced him to join the battle, to take the company to court. And now here they were, in this very courtroom, facing off against a system that had wronged them both. Lucy had always believed in the power of truth, and she knew that her father's work would eventually come to light. But as the trial unfolded, she could see the toll it was taking on Frank. The sneers from the judge, the mocking remarks from the opposing lawyers, it was all too much. Clint Eastwood's unexpected appearance had thrown the courtroom into chaos. Lucy hadn't expected him to show up, no one had. But Frank and Clint went way back. They had been friends for decades, ever since Frank had first moved to California and started working on his solar technology. Clint had been one of the few people who truly understood Frank's genius, and their bond had only grown stronger over the years. Lucy remembered the first time she met Clint. She had been a teenager, and her father had taken her to one of Clint's movies. She had always known Clint as a legend, a man who had achieved incredible things in his own right, but it wasn't until that night that she truly understood the depth of his friendship with her father. Clint had been nothing but kind to her, always asking about her life, offering words of encouragement. She had often wondered why Clint had stuck by her father through all these years, especially when Frank had withdrawn from the world. But now, seeing Clint stand in the courtroom, ready to testify on Frank's behalf, she understood. Clint wasn't just a famous actor or director, he was a man who valued loyalty and friendship above all else. And for that, Lucy was eternally grateful. As Clint spoke, his words rang clear and true. Frank Franklin is a genius, he had said, his voice unwavering. His work has changed the world, and it deserves to be recognized. Lucy felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had always known her father's worth, but hearing someone like Clint Eastwood, someone who had lived through so many triumphs and losses, speak so passionately about Frank's legacy was a moment she would never forget. The courtroom had grown quieter as Clint spoke, and for the first time, Lucy saw a glimmer of doubt in the judge's eyes. She had seen that look before, in the faces of those who underestimated her father. It was the look of realization, the moment when people finally understood that Frank Franklin was not a man to be taken lightly. As Clint finished speaking, Frank remained silent, his expression unreadable. But deep inside, a sense of calm washed over him. He had spent years in the shadows, hiding from the world that had abandoned him. But now, with Clint by his side and his daughter in the courtroom, Frank knew that his time had come. This trial was not just about winning a lawsuit, it was about reclaiming what was rightfully his, and proving that even the elderly and forgotten could still change the world. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The tension was palpable, and Frank could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The judge, who had been so dismissive moments earlier, was now looking at Frank with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Clint Eastwood had made a powerful statement, but the battle was far from over. The opposing counsel, a slick corporate lawyer named Harold Peterson, leaned forward in his chair. He was a man who had made a career out of dismantling cases like Frank's. His reputation was built on tearing down the stories of those who thought they had been wronged, spinning lies into truths with sharp words and a keen understanding of the law. He was ruthless, and he was about to go on the offensive. "Your Honor," Peterson began, his voice smooth and calculated, "while Mr. Eastwood may hold Mr. Franklin in high regard, we cannot allow celebrity endorsements to cloud the truth. The fact remains that Mr. Franklin's patents are not what he believes them to be. His so-called invention is outdated, no longer relevant, and frankly, has no place in today's world." Frank's hands tightened around the edge of the table, the familiar frustration bubbling to the surface. He had heard these words before, too many times. The corporations that had stolen his work had always tried to diminish his achievements, convincing the world that he was a has-been, a relic of a bygone era. But Frank knew better. His invention was still ahead of its time, still capable of changing the world. Clint Eastwood, standing behind Frank, shot a look of disdain toward Peterson. "You can try to spin your story however you want, Harold," Clint said, his voice low but unwavering, "but the truth doesn't change. Frank's invention will stand the test of time, no matter how hard you try to erase it." Peterson smirked but didn't engage further. He knew that Clint's words carried weight, but he also knew that the legal battle was far from over. His goal was simple: discredit Frank, make him seem like a man who had lost touch with reality. If he could do that, the jury would be more likely to side with the corporation. And with all the resources they had at their disposal, Peterson was confident he could win. Frank could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent years in isolation, disconnected from the world. But now, as the trial unfolded, he realized that this was more than just a legal matter, it was a battle for his legacy. He couldn't afford to lose. As the hours dragged on, the courtroom was filled with arguments, counterarguments, and evidence. Peterson's team was relentless, presenting testimony from so-called experts who claimed that Frank's invention had been obsolete for years. But Frank refused to back down. Every time Peterson tried to paint him as a fool, Frank stood tall, his eyes never wavering from the truth. He had the evidence, the data, and the knowledge that could prove his case. But would it be enough? Clint, too, was on the offensive. He had been a quiet force, his words measured and precise. But his presence in the courtroom was undeniable. He wasn't just defending his friend, he was staking his reputation on the truth of Frank's work. And while the legal battle raged on, Clint was also pushing for something more important, a shift in public perception. He wanted people to understand that Frank Franklin wasn't just some forgotten scientist, he was a visionary, a man whose ideas had changed the world, even if the world had never recognized it. "Let's be clear, Mr. Peterson," Clint said as he stood up, addressing the courtroom. "You can call Frank's work outdated, but the truth is that the world simply wasn't ready for it. That's why his invention never gained traction. The technology was too advanced for its time." The room grew silent. Clint's words carried a weight that had not been there before. Even Peterson seemed momentarily taken aback. But Frank wasn't ready to let the momentum slip. He leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with the conviction that had defined his life's work. "The world wasn't ready," Frank echoed, his eyes scanning the room. "But I never stopped believing in the power of my invention. And I still don't." The judge, who had been sitting quietly, observing the exchange, cleared his throat. "Mr. Franklin," he said, his voice laced with skepticism, "you may believe in your invention, but that doesn't change the fact that the patent has been invalidated. The company now holds full rights to it. Your claims are based on ideas that no longer hold any merit in today's market." Frank's heart sank. It was the moment he had feared, the moment when the courtroom would begin to side with the corporate giants, dismissing his work as irrelevant. But Frank wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. His attorney, Rachel, stood up and spoke with a calm but assertive voice. "Your Honor, we respectfully disagree with your interpretation of the situation. We have evidence that Mr. Franklin's technology is still relevant, and we intend to prove that in this court." The judge's expression softened for a moment, but only briefly. "Very well," he said. "We will adjourn for today. You will have time to present your evidence. But know this, time is not on your side, Mr. Franklin." As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Frank's mind raced. The conflict was escalating, and the stakes were higher than ever. He had no intention of losing this fight, but he could feel the weight of the challenge ahead. The courtroom, with its cold walls and harsh scrutiny, was not the place where he had thrived. He had once excelled in labs, in the quiet pursuit of knowledge. But now, the battle was no longer just about science, it was about something deeper. It was about justice, recognition, and the chance to reclaim what was rightfully his. Clint placed a reassuring hand on Frank's shoulder as they walked out of the courtroom together. "Don't let them get to you," Clint said quietly. "This is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go." Frank nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. Clint, Rachel, and Lucy were with him. And together, they would see this through. As the day came to an end, Frank found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had once believed that his work was forgotten, that his contributions would never be recognized. But now, as the courtroom battle raged on, he realized that this was his chance to make things right. He had fought too long and too hard to give up now. The days following the courtroom session had been a blur for Frank. Each time he closed his eyes, the echoes of the trial haunted him, Peterson's sharp words, the cold dismissal of his invention, and the skepticism in the judge's eyes. But despite the weight of it all, Frank found a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't give up now, not when he had come so far. His entire life had been building up to this moment, and he was determined to see it through. The journey ahead would not be easy. Frank knew that better than anyone. His invention had been buried for decades, forgotten by most and stolen by those who cared only for profit. But now, with Clint, Rachel, and Lucy by his side, Frank felt as though he had a second chance to fight for what was rightfully his. It wasn't just about reclaiming a patent, it was about restoring his legacy and proving that his work had value. Frank sat at his desk late into the night, flipping through old notebooks and blueprints. The dim light of the desk lamp cast long shadows over the pages as he searched for the one piece of evidence that could turn the tide in his favor. He had already given everything he had to the case, but there was something missing, something he had overlooked in his earlier rush to present the technology to the court. He needed to prove that his invention was not just a brilliant idea, but a revolutionary one. Rachel had suggested they bring in a new set of experts, people who could offer fresh perspectives on Frank's work. But Frank knew that the right kind of evidence was hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. It was buried within the intricate designs, the technical details, and the heart of the invention itself. His fingers traced the lines of the old blueprints, each curve and angle bringing back memories of long hours spent perfecting the design. He remembered the late nights in the lab, the moments when the world had seemed to disappear, and all that mattered was the technology. But now, as he looked at the diagrams, something clicked. "I've got it," Frank muttered to himself. He grabbed a notebook from the pile beside him, his hands shaking slightly as he scribbled down his thoughts. The breakthrough wasn't just about the technology, it was about showing the world that the vision behind it had never been fully realized. It wasn't just a solution to energy problems, it was a glimpse into the future. He didn't sleep that night. Frank worked tirelessly, refining his arguments and gathering the pieces of evidence he had nearly forgotten. By the time morning light filtered through the curtains, he had something, a new angle, a new approach that could change everything. The next day, Clint and Rachel were waiting for him in the small office he kept in the back of his house. Lucy, too, had arrived early. She was holding a cup of coffee, her face filled with concern but also a quiet resolve. She had always believed in her father, even when no one else did. Clint stood up when Frank entered, his eyes scanning the older man's face. "You look like you've had a long night," he remarked. "I have," Frank replied, taking a seat at the table. "But I think I've got something that can turn this whole thing around." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Frank said with a smile. "Just the truth. It's always been there, we just need to present it the right way." With a steady hand, Frank spread out his notes and blueprints on the table. "I've been so focused on proving the viability of the technology, I forgot the bigger picture. What's important isn't just the solar cells. What's important is the vision behind them. I created something that could have changed the world, but it wasn't just about energy, it was about changing the way people thought about technology. The world wasn't ready for it back then, but it is now. Lucy leaned in, studying the papers. So, this is more than just a lawsuit. It's a statement. Exactly, Frank replied. We need to show the court that this invention wasn't just about technology, it was a vision of the future. And if we can make them see that, if we can get the jury to understand the importance of what I created, we can win this. Rachel took a deep breath, clearly processing the gravity of Frank's words. We'll need to present it in a way that even a layperson can understand. And we'll need to be strategic, there's no room for error. We have no choice but to win, Frank said quietly. My entire life has led me to this point. If we lose this, it'll be like everything I've worked for is erased. And I can't let that happen. Clint's gaze softened as he looked at Frank. You won't let it happen. We'll make sure of that. The plan was set. Frank's new approach would center on the broader vision behind his work, positioning his invention not just as a product, but as a cornerstone of a new way of thinking about energy and technology. They would bring in experts to explain the significance of the work, but they would also use Frank's own words to demonstrate his vision. And Clint, ever the storyteller, would help frame the narrative in a way that the jury, and the public, could understand. As they made preparations for the next day's session, Frank couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't just about winning, it was about something deeper. It was about restoring his faith in the world. He had spent so many years on the sidelines, watching as his work was twisted and taken from him. But now, for the first time in years, Frank could see a way forward. The next day in court, the tension was even higher than before. As Frank entered, his heart pounded in his chest, but there was a new calmness to his step. He knew that this time, things were different. The path ahead might still be treacherous, but it was the only path that mattered. As the trial resumed, Rachel stood first, presenting Frank's work to the jury once more. But this time, it wasn't just about the technical aspects. She spoke of vision, of innovation, of the promise of a future that could have been. She painted a picture of the world Frank had dreamed of, a world where clean, sustainable energy could power everything, from homes to entire cities. And then it was Frank's turn. His hands were steady as he approached the witness stand. The room fell silent as Frank took his seat. He looked directly at the jury, his gaze unwavering. I created something that could have changed the world, he began, his voice clear and strong. But the world wasn't ready for it. People didn't understand the vision behind it, and that's why it was buried. But now, I'm here to tell you that the world is ready. It's time for this technology to see the light of day. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that hangs just before something momentous happens. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he sat in the witness chair, his eyes locked on the faces of the jurors. He had said what he needed to say, laid out the vision behind his invention, and made the case for why it was important. But now, it was out of his hands. It was up to the jury to decide whether or not they believed him. The opposing counsel, Harold Peterson, had been relentless in his efforts to discredit Frank's claims. He had pulled apart the details of the invention, questioned Frank's motives, and painted a picture of an outdated man clinging to ideas that no longer had any value in the modern world. It was a brutal strategy, one designed to wear Frank down, to make him second-guess his every word. But Frank refused to buckle. He had spent decades fighting for his work, for his vision. He wasn't about to let someone like Peterson take it all away. And yet, as he sat there, watching the jury's faces, Frank couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The room felt like it was closing in on him. He thought about his late nights in the lab, the sacrifices he had made, and the way his invention had been taken from him. He thought about the years of doubt, the ridicule, the isolation. And then, he thought about Lucy, sitting just a few rows behind him, her face filled with the same hope and fear that Frank felt. Clint, too, was there, standing just behind Frank, his quiet strength a steady presence. Frank could feel the support of his old friend, but he also knew that the road ahead was uncertain. The fate of his invention, and his legacy, rested in the hands of these 12 strangers, and no matter how much they believed in his vision, it wouldn't be enough if the jury didn't. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing the jurors time to deliberate. Frank stepped out of the courtroom, his mind racing. He couldn't sit still, couldn't wait for the verdict. He walked down the long hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. "Dad, are you okay?" Lucy's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her face etched with concern. "I'm fine," Frank replied, though his voice betrayed him. "I just need some time to think." Lucy walked toward him, her step steady but filled with the same anxiety that Frank felt. "I know this is hard," she said softly, "but you've done everything you can. You've fought for so long, and now it's out of your hands. All we can do is wait." Frank's eyes flicked to the floor. He wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the comfort of those words. But how could he? The years of rejection, of seeing his ideas stolen and twisted, weighed too heavily on him. And now, after everything, he could only hope that the jury would see the truth in his words. Just then, Clint appeared, walking down the hallway toward them. He gave Frank a reassuring nod. "Hey, I know it feels like a lifetime in here, but we'll get through this. You've got a team behind you, Frank. We all believe in you." Frank looked at Clint, his old friend, and felt a wave of gratitude. He had never imagined that someone like Clint Eastwood, a man who had lived a life of his own extraordinary accomplishments, would take the time to stand by him. It wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about the belief that Frank had value, that his work had value. Clint had made him feel like he wasn't just some forgotten man. He was a man with a legacy, and no matter what happened in the courtroom, that was something that could never be taken away. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Clint," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. Clint put a hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together, Frank. We've got this. You've already won by showing the world who you are. Now, let's just see what happens." The three of them stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them like a thick fog. The uncertainty was overwhelming, but at the same time, there was a flicker of hope. They had fought for this moment, and now all they could do was wait. Back in the courtroom, the jury had returned. The judge called the proceedings to order, and Frank could feel his heart pounding in his chest. It was time. The room fell silent as the foreman of the jury stood up, holding the verdict in his hands. Frank's eyes locked onto the paper as the words seemed to blur before him. His palms were sweaty, his breath shallow. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The moment that would either make or break everything he had worked for. The foreman cleared his throat and read aloud, "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Frank Franklin, and hereby declare the patent in question to be valid. The defendants are ordered to compensate Mr. Franklin for the unauthorized use of his invention." Frank's mind reeled. The words didn't seem real, didn't seem to belong to him. He had won. After all the years of struggle, of setbacks, and of doubt, he had won. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of disbelief and approval, but all Frank could hear was the pounding of his own heart. He turned to Clint, who was already smiling at him, his eyes bright with pride. "You did it, Frank," Clint said, his voice filled with emotion. "You really did it." Lucy rushed toward him, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, we did it," she cried, wrapping her arms around him. The aftermath of the trial felt surreal to Frank. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, the pressure that had built up over the years began to lift. He stood at the center of the storm, victorious, yet oddly still. The victory in court was his, but the road to getting there had transformed him in ways he had not expected. In the days following the verdict, the media had taken an intense interest in Frank's story. Headlines read, "Inventor battles for justice and Frank Franklin, the man who proved the world wrong." The attention was overwhelming, and Frank had to admit that he wasn't used to the spotlight. For so many years, his life had been confined to the shadows, buried beneath work, rejection, and the silence of obscurity. But now, suddenly, he was thrust into a world of cameras and microphones, reporters eager to hear his story. "I never wanted any of this attention," Frank had told Rachel during one of their meetings. "All I ever wanted was for people to recognize the value of what I created. But now, it feels like I'm being celebrated for something I never expected." Rachel had smiled knowingly, sitting across from him at the small cafe where they often met. "It's not just the invention, Frank. It's who you are. People are drawn to the story of a man who never gave up, who fought against all odds. Your story resonates with so many who feel like they've been overlooked or forgotten. You've shown them that it's never too late to make a change." Frank nodded, though he didn't feel fully comfortable with the praise. It wasn't about him. It had never been about him. It had always been about the technology, the idea that could change the world. The victory in court was a validation of that, not just of him as a person. Still, he couldn't deny that something within him had shifted. After years of fighting, years of feeling invisible, he had learned something vital about himself. Resilience wasn't about holding on to the past, it was about looking forward to the future. And now, after everything, he could finally see the horizon clearly. As Frank sat in his study, looking over the documents related to the case, his thoughts began to wander. He thought about how much had changed since the trial. The technology that had been the center of his life for decades was no longer just a dream. It was real, recognized, and had the potential to change the world. He couldn't keep it to himself anymore. He needed to share it in the way he had always intended. Not for fame or fortune, but because the world needed to see it. But there was still the question of what came next. The victory in court had been crucial, but there was a long road ahead. Frank had been given a chance to reclaim his legacy, but that was only the beginning. How could he take his invention from the courtroom to the world? How could he ensure it wasn't buried once again, forgotten by those who had the power to make it a reality? The door to his study creaked open, and Lucy stepped inside, carrying a cup of tea. She set it down on the desk beside him and took a seat. "You're still up, huh?" "I can't stop thinking about it," Frank admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like I've been fighting for so long, and now that I've won, I'm not sure what to do next." Lucy smiled softly. "I think the hardest part is over, Dad. You've done what so many people thought was impossible. Now it's just about taking the next steps. It's about making your vision a reality. You've already proven that the world is ready for it. You just need to show them what comes next." Frank looked at his daughter, seeing the wisdom in her words. "I'm just not sure how to start," he confessed. "The invention is important, but it's not just about the technology. It's about convincing people to believe in it. To believe in me. You don't have to do it alone, you know," Lucy said gently. "You've got us. You've got Clint, you've got Rachel, and you've got me. Together, we can make this happen." Frank's chest tightened at the thought of how much his daughter believed in him. She had always been his anchor, the one who had never given up on him even when he had lost faith in himself. But now, Frank could see the truth of her words. He didn't have to do it alone. He had the resources. He had the support. And most importantly, he had the belief that this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for something bigger. It was a fight to change the world. Clint had reached out to several investors in the wake of the trial, and soon, Frank found himself sitting in a sleek conference room with a group of business leaders eager to discuss the potential of his invention. The room was filled with polished suits, eager smiles, and sharp minds, all interested in what Frank had created. It was a far cry from the dim-lit laboratory he had spent so many years working in. But it was exactly where he needed to be. "We've seen the evidence, Frank," one of the investors said, leaning forward. "The technology you've developed is groundbreaking. We're excited about the potential it has in the market. But the real question is, what do you want out of all of this?" Frank took a deep breath. The words felt natural now, as if they had been waiting to be spoken for decades. "I want the world to see the value of this technology, not just as a product, but as a solution. I want to see it used to solve real problems. To change the way we think about energy. It's not about the money. It's about the future." There was a pause in the room. The investors exchanged glances, sizing up Frank. But in that moment, Frank didn't feel nervous. He felt sure. He had spent his entire life working toward this moment, and now that it had arrived, he could see the path forward clearly. Finally, the lead investor spoke. "We're in. Let's make it happen." In the days that followed, Frank's invention began to take the shape of something real. It was no longer just an idea that lived in blueprints or patents. It was something tangible, something that could help change the future. Frank and his team worked tirelessly to bring the invention to the masses, setting up partnerships with sustainable energy companies, pushing the technology to the forefront of the conversation. With Clint's guidance and Rachel's strategic mind, they were able to navigate the complex world of business and innovation, making sure the technology reached the right hands. And through it all, Frank never lost sight of what truly mattered. The invention wasn't just about energy, it was about the chance to leave the world a little better than he had found it. And as he sat in his lab once again, surrounded by the hum of machines and the promise of a new future, Frank realized that it had all been worth it. The struggle, the sacrifices, the uncertainty, it had all led him to this moment. The months that followed the trial felt like a whirlwind. Frank's invention was no longer just a dream or a patent, it was becoming a part of the world's technological landscape. He had secured the support of investors, formed partnerships, and even started talks with government agencies about its potential for sustainable energy initiatives. But amidst all the excitement, Frank never forgot the struggles that had brought him here. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Clint, standing in the doorway with a wide grin on his face. "You look like you've been at that desk for days," Clint said with a chuckle, stepping inside. "How's it going?" Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been juggling 1,000 things at once, and I'm not sure if I'm even keeping track anymore." "There's so much to do, Clint. So much at stake. I'm not sure I can manage all of this on my own." Clint raised an eyebrow and leaned against the doorframe. "You don't have to. That's the thing, Frank. You've got a team now. You've got me, Lucy, Rachel, and everyone who's joined you on this journey. You've already fought the toughest battle. This is the beginning of the rest of your life." Frank smiled faintly. He knew Clint was right. The fight was over, but the work was just beginning. "Yeah, I guess you're right," Frank replied. "But it's not just about the invention anymore. It's about how we bring it into the world, how we make sure it helps people. I don't want it to just be another breakthrough that gets lost in the shuffle. This has to matter." Clint nodded, his expression serious now. "It will, Frank. It's more than just a product. It's a movement. You've already shown the world the power of persistence. Now you have to show them the power of the idea itself." Meanwhile, Lucy had been a driving force behind the public relations efforts. She had been working tirelessly to craft the narrative around Frank's invention, making sure that people understood the true value of it, not just as a technological marvel, but as a solution to real-world problems. Frank knew how much work she had put into it, and he admired her passion. One evening, Lucy invited Frank to join her at a press event that had been set up to introduce the world to his invention. It wasn't just any press event, it was being covered by major news outlets, technology magazines, and influential sustainability advocates. This would be the first time the public would get a real glimpse of Frank's invention, and it was crucial that everything went perfectly. As they made their way to the venue, Frank felt the familiar stirrings of nerves in his stomach. It wasn't the cameras or the attention that unsettled him, it was the pressure to live up to the hype, to make sure his invention truly had the impact he believed it could have. "You've got this, Dad," Lucy said, giving him a reassuring smile as they walked toward the stage. "Just remember, this is your moment. You've spent years preparing for it, and now the world is ready to hear your story." "I hope they're ready," Frank muttered, his gaze fixed on the crowd assembling in the hall. The press event was filled with the hum of conversations and the flashes of cameras as reporters mingled. The room was filled with influential figures in technology, business, and sustainability, all eager to learn about the new breakthrough. Frank could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. This was no longer just about his invention, it was about changing the way people thought about energy, about shaping a future that was more sustainable. Finally, the moment came. Frank was called to the stage, and the room fell silent as he took his place at the podium. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, and for a moment, he hesitated. But then, he saw Lucy in the audience, standing beside Clint, their faces full of support. He remembered all the hard work that had brought him here, all the obstacles he had overcome. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was about something far greater. With a deep breath, Frank began. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Frank Franklin, and I'm here to talk to you about something that has been the culmination of years of work, research, and, yes, even failure. This invention, this idea, was something that I believed in when no one else did. I've faced skepticism, rejection, and even ridicule. But I've also learned that the greatest inventions don't always come from the brightest minds, they come from those who are willing to push forward when everyone else has given up." He paused, looking out at the audience, and saw a few nods of recognition. "My invention is more than just a product. It's a solution. It's a way to change the future of energy, to provide cleaner, more sustainable power to people all around the world. It's about making sure that the next generation doesn't inherit the mistakes of the past. It's about giving people hope. And most importantly, it's about showing the world that no matter how many times you fail, you can still rise again." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Frank's voice had grown steadier, stronger, as he spoke from the heart. He could feel the connection with the people in the room, the shared understanding that this was more than just a business opportunity. It was a chance to change the course of history. "I stand here today not just as an inventor, but as a man who has fought for something he believes in," Frank continued. "And I invite you all to join me in this journey. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can create a future that is not just brighter, but better." The room erupted into applause, and Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about showing the world what he had known all along, that persistence, belief, and vision could change the world. Later that evening, as Frank and Lucy walked back to the car, Frank couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The event had gone far better than he had expected. The world was starting to take notice, and that meant everything. He had fought for so long, endured so many obstacles, and now, at last, the world was starting to see the truth. "We did it, Dad," Lucy said, her voice full of pride. "You did it." Frank smiled and put a hand on her shoulder. "No, Lucy. We did it." With the success of the press event, Frank's life entered a new phase. The world was suddenly watching, eager to see where his invention would go next. The response had been overwhelming, investors were calling, media outlets wanted interviews, and people were reaching out from every corner of the globe, curious to know more about the technology that could change the way they lived. But for Frank, it wasn't enough to simply bask in the success of the moment. He knew that the real challenge lay ahead. His invention had the potential to reshape the future of energy, but only if it was executed properly. It wasn't just about getting attention, it was about turning that attention into real action. As the weeks passed, Frank became consumed with meetings and discussions about manufacturing, scaling, and distribution. His invention was no longer just an idea, it was a product, and that came with its own set of challenges. One morning, as Frank sat at his desk sifting through emails, Rachel knocked on his office door. She stepped inside, holding a thick folder in her hands. "Got a minute?" she asked, setting the folder down on his desk. "Of course," Frank replied, rubbing his eyes. He'd been up late the night before going over the technical specifications for the first production run. "What's in the folder?" "It's the latest proposal from the manufacturing team," Rachel said, pulling up a chair. "They've done a detailed analysis of the cost breakdown for mass production. It's a bit more expensive than we anticipated." Frank looked over the figures. The numbers made his stomach tighten. While the technology itself was groundbreaking, manufacturing it on a large scale wasn't going to be cheap. The cost of raw materials, the intricacies of the design, and the need for specialized equipment all added up. "This could put a real dent in our profit margin," Frank muttered, his eyes scanning the figures. "We need to find a way to lower the costs without compromising the quality." Rachel nodded. "I know. But we can't rush it either. If we cut corners on quality, it's not just the product that suffers, it's the entire future of the technology. We need to strike a balance." Frank leaned back in his chair, thinking. He understood Rachel's point, but the pressure to make this work was mounting. If they didn't find a way to reduce production costs, it could jeopardize everything they had worked for. "We'll figure it out," Frank said, more to himself than to Rachel. "We always do." Later that day, Frank received an unexpected phone call. It was Clint. "You busy?" Clint asked, his voice full of energy. "Always," Frank replied, looking over the latest financial reports. "But what's up?" "I've been thinking," Clint began, "you've got this world-changing invention, right? And now, you're dealing with all these manufacturing hurdles. But what if there was a way to completely shift the conversation? What if you could get ahead of the curve, rather than just playing catch-up?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "What are you getting at?" "I'm saying, what if we didn't just think about mass production the way everyone else does? What if we took a different approach and made it more sustainable, more scalable? You've got the tech to change the game, now let's change the way it's made." Clint's words struck a chord with Frank. He had been so focused on scaling the technology that he hadn't stopped to think about how it could be scaled differently. What if there was a more innovative way to build and distribute the product, something that was aligned with the very values that the technology represented: sustainability, efficiency, and forward-thinking? "I like the sound of that," Frank said, a spark of excitement in his voice. "What do you have in mind?" Clint was already on it. "I've been in touch with a few companies that specialize in cutting-edge, sustainable manufacturing practices. They've got technologies that could revolutionize how we produce your invention. Not only could we lower the costs, but we could do it in a way that aligns with the eco-friendly vision you've always had." Frank sat up straighter in his chair. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about reimagining the entire process. This could be the key to taking his invention to the next level. "We need to meet with them," Frank said, his voice determined. "Let's make it happen." In the following weeks, Frank and Clint worked closely with the new manufacturing partners. They explored new ways to streamline production, incorporating sustainable materials, and cutting-edge processes that not only reduced costs but also minimized environmental impact. It was a risk, but it was a risk worth taking. As the pieces started to fall into place, Frank could feel the weight of the past few years lifting. For the first time, he was seeing the full picture, not just as an inventor, but as a leader, guiding his creation into the world. But just as things began to take shape, another challenge arose. Frank had just returned from a series of meetings with the new manufacturing team when he received an alarming email from Rachel. She was in the middle of some critical discussions with potential investors, and it seemed that a competitor had come out of nowhere with a similar technology. "Are you serious?" Frank muttered under his breath as he read the email. "We've been working on this for years, and now someone else is trying to steal our thunder." Rachel's email explained that the competitor, a large energy company with substantial resources, had just announced a breakthrough in renewable energy technology that was shockingly similar to Frank's invention. They had already secured significant funding, and the media was eating it up. "This could be a huge problem," Rachel had written. "They've got the backing and the reputation. We need to move fast, or we could lose our edge." Frank's heart sank. Just when things seemed to be coming together, the specter of competition loomed large. He had always known there would be challenges, but this felt like a direct threat to everything they had worked for. He couldn't afford to let this competitor get ahead, especially with the resources they had at their disposal. He sat in his office, staring at the computer screen. The feeling of uncertainty, of fighting against forces beyond his control, began to creep back in. But Frank had been here before. He had fought for recognition, for validation, and for a future that many had told him was impossible. He wasn't about to give up now. Frank's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he drafted a response to Rachel. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to back down. They had something unique. Something that had the potential to outlast any competitor. "We'll keep pushing forward," Frank typed. "We've come this far, and we're not stopping now. Let's focus on what sets us apart, our vision, our values, and the technology that can change the world." The message sent, Frank leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing in determination. This was just another obstacle. Another battle to fight. But he wasn't afraid. He had never been afraid. Not after everything he had been through. The road ahead was long, and it wouldn't be easy. But Frank was more prepared than ever to face whatever came next. Frank's resolve was tested more than ever as he faced off against his biggest competitor. The energy company that had introduced a similar technology was no small player. They had the resources, the influence, and a well-established presence in the industry. On top of that, they had secured substantial funding from high-profile investors, making them a formidable opponent. But Frank wasn't deterred. Over the years, he had learned that success wasn't always about having the biggest bank account or the loudest voice. It was about the passion and determination to see a dream through, no matter the odds. And that was something Frank had in spades. He spent the next few weeks buried in work. Meetings with potential investors had become increasingly stressful, with many of them questioning whether his invention could stand out in such a competitive market. Frank could see the doubt in their eyes, but he wasn't ready to give up. He knew that his invention was different. It had something that the competition lacked: a purpose. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about making a real difference in the world. But the stress was beginning to take its toll on Frank. He found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to outmaneuver the competition. It wasn't just the technical challenges, it was the constant pressure of needing to prove himself, of fighting for something that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. One evening, Clint stopped by Frank's office to check in. He had noticed the toll that the stress was taking on his friend. "You're burning the candle at both ends, Frank," Clint said, leaning against the doorframe. "You've been at this for years. You've fought for this invention every step of the way. But you can't keep going like this. You need a break." Frank glanced up from the stack of papers on his desk, his eyes tired. "I don't have time for a break, Clint. The competition is closing in. If we don't do something soon, we'll get left behind." Clint stepped further into the office and sat down across from Frank. "I get it, man. I really do. But you're not going to win this war by running yourself into the ground. You've built something incredible. Now you have to trust in it. Trust in yourself. You've already done the impossible. This is just another hurdle. Frank rubbed his temples. I don't know, Clint. I feel like every time I take one step forward, something else comes up to push me 2 steps back. What if we're not enough? What if the competition beats us to the punch? Frank took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Clint's words sink in. For the first time in a long while, he let himself relax, just for a moment. Clint was right, he had been through so much already. Maybe it was time to stop worrying about what the competition was doing and focus on what he could control. His vision, his team, and his commitment to making a difference. The following week, Frank and Rachel decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to outcompete the energy giant head-on, they would double down on their unique strengths, sustainability, ethical manufacturing, and a product that genuinely made a difference. They would focus on their mission, not the competition. Rachel reached out to a few key contacts in the media, arranging interviews that would highlight the values behind Frank's invention. Frank agreed to a sit-down with a well-known sustainability journalist who had been following the progress of his invention for some time. The interview was set up at a local coffee shop, a quiet spot where Frank could speak freely without the distraction of corporate pressures. As the journalist, a woman named Kate, set up her recorder, Frank couldn't help but feel the nerves bubbling up inside him. This wasn't just about explaining his technology, it was about reminding the world why this invention mattered. Kate smiled warmly, sensing Frank's unease. Take a deep breath, Frank. I'm not here to grill you. I just want to hear your story. Frank smiled back, nodding. I guess I've had a lot of practice telling it. She laughed softly. I'm sure you have. But this time, I want to hear what drives you. What makes this invention different? What's the story behind it? Frank took a moment to gather his thoughts, his eyes meeting Kate's. This technology, this idea, it's more than just a product. It's a solution to a problem that's been plaguing us for years, our reliance on unsustainable energy sources. I didn't create this to make money or get rich. I created it because I believe we have a responsibility to future generations. The energy crisis is real, and if we don't act now, we'll pay the price. Kate nodded thoughtfully. That's powerful. But there are so many companies out there promising to change the world with their green tech. What makes your invention stand out? Frank leaned in slightly, his voice becoming more passionate. It's not just about the technology, it's about how we approach it. We've designed this with sustainability in mind every step of the way. From the materials we use to the manufacturing process, we've worked to ensure that we don't just create something innovative, we create something that aligns with the values we hold dear. And we're committed to making sure this technology is accessible, not just to the wealthiest, but to everyone. The interview went on for over an hour, but Frank found himself feeling lighter, more focused. For the first time in weeks, he was able to speak openly about why this mattered, and the conviction in his voice seemed to resonate with Kate. As they wrapped up, Kate smiled. I think the world needs to hear this. You've got a powerful story, Frank. And this invention? It's more than just tech. It's a message. Frank thanked her and walked out of the coffee shop feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For so long, he had been consumed by the battle against the competition, worried about what they were doing and how they might overshadow his work. But now, he realized that his invention wasn't just another product, it was a symbol of change. And that message was something no competitor could take away. The next day, the interview with Kate was published, and it quickly gained traction online. Articles, blog posts, and social media posts began to flood in, all centered around Frank's vision and his unwavering commitment to creating a sustainable future. It was clear that Frank had touched something deep within the public consciousness, a desire for something more, something real. Even in the face of intense competition, Frank had found a way to remind the world of why his invention mattered. And with each new wave of support, he knew he was one step closer to achieving the impact he had always dreamed of. The road ahead would still be tough, but Frank had made it clear, he wasn't backing down. The world was listening, and now, it was time to show them just what his invention could do. The following months were a whirlwind of progress and setbacks, triumphs and frustrations. Frank's invention was starting to gain real momentum. Investors were beginning to show interest, and the media was buzzing with his name. But in the background, the competition was never far behind, and the pressure to keep up with their aggressive moves was unrelenting. Despite the mounting pressure, Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The unique approach they were taking, focusing on sustainable practices and ethical manufacturing, was starting to pay off. It wasn't just about making a profit anymore, it was about making a statement, about showing the world that it was possible to innovate without compromising on core values. Frank's team had been working around the clock to prepare for the next phase, finalizing the design, improving the efficiency of the manufacturing process, and securing partnerships with distributors who believed in the vision. Frank knew that this was the moment to solidify his place in the industry. But there were still lingering doubts, moments when he would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something could go wrong. One afternoon, as Frank sat in his office, reviewing the progress reports from the manufacturing team, Rachel came in with a new proposal. She had a look on her face that Frank immediately recognized, the look that meant she had something important to share. "Got a minute?" she asked, setting a thick folder on his desk. Frank nodded, signaling for her to go ahead. "We've received an offer," Rachel began, her voice measured. "A major investment firm wants to back us, and they're offering a significant amount of capital, more than we'd ever imagined." Frank raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like good news, right?" "It is," Rachel replied, her tone neutral. "But there's a catch. The firm wants more control over the direction of the company. They're willing to fund the next phase of development, but they want a say in the decision-making process. They're also asking for a larger equity stake." Frank's gut tightened. He had always known that taking on investors meant making compromises, but this felt like a bigger decision than he was ready for. The offer was tempting: money, resources, the ability to scale quickly, but at what cost? "Are we ready to give up that much control?" Frank asked, his voice low. Rachel hesitated. "I think we need to consider it carefully. We've come a long way, but the competition is getting fierce. We're going to need more than just passion and commitment to stay ahead." Frank leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. He knew that he couldn't do it all on his own anymore. The stakes had gotten too high. But the idea of handing over too much control, of losing the very thing that made his invention unique, unsettled him. "We can't let them change the heart of what we've built," Frank said after a long pause. "This isn't just a business, it's a movement. We need to find investors who understand that." Rachel nodded. "I agree. But we have to act fast. The window for this kind of funding won't stay open forever." The decision weighed heavily on Frank as he continued to mull it over. He knew he couldn't keep everything to himself, but he also knew that any decision he made now would have lasting consequences. The future of his invention, and his entire vision, was at stake. A few days later, Frank met with Clint at a local diner to get his thoughts on the matter. Clint had always been a sounding board for Frank, someone who could offer a fresh perspective when things seemed clouded. "Rachel filled me in on the offer," Clint said, stirring his coffee. "Sounds like a big deal, but I can understand why you're hesitant." "Yeah, it's a lot of money," Frank replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But at what cost? We're talking about giving up a chunk of the company. I don't want to lose the integrity of what we're doing just to get a few zeros on the check." Clint leaned back in his seat, considering Frank's words. "I get that. But you can't do it all on your own, Frank. You know that. The money's not just to make the company bigger, it's about reaching more people, getting the technology into the hands of those who need it most. You're not selling out. You're making it happen on a larger scale." "I know," Frank said quietly. "But every step forward feels like I'm losing a piece of myself. I don't want to become one of those guys who just chases profits and forgets why he started. Clint smiled knowingly. You're not that guy, Frank. The money doesn't change who you are, unless you let it. It's not about the money, it's about the impact. And you're going to make a hell of an impact. Frank took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Clint's words sink in. Maybe Clint was right. This wasn't about selling out, it was about making the vision a reality. The world needed this invention, and if taking on investors was the way to make it happen, then maybe it was time to take that step. Okay, Frank said, finally feeling a sense of clarity. Let's do it. But we do it on our terms. We maintain control over the vision. If they want to invest, they need to respect what we're doing. Clint raised his glass in a silent toast. To making it happen. In the weeks that followed, Frank and Rachel worked tirelessly to secure a deal that would give them the resources they needed without compromising their vision. After tense negotiations, they managed to strike a deal with the investment firm that gave them the capital they needed to move forward, while still maintaining control over the direction of the company. With the funding in place, Frank's team was able to accelerate production, improve the technology, and expand the reach of their invention. For the first time, Frank felt like they were truly on the path to something bigger than himself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now he had the resources and support to face whatever challenges came their way. As the company grew, so did the impact of their work. More and more people began to see the potential of Frank's invention, not just as a new product, but as a catalyst for change in the world. But even as they gained momentum, the competition remained fierce. Frank knew that every step forward meant facing new obstacles. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As the funding deal with the investment firm was finalized, Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The financial security it offered was exactly what the company needed to scale quickly, but it also brought a new set of challenges. The pressure was now higher than ever, and Frank was well aware that the stakes had only gotten larger. His invention wasn't just a small startup anymore, it was something the world had started to take notice of, and that spotlight brought its own burdens. Despite the overwhelming sense of responsibility, Frank found himself energized. The investment gave them the means to bring his vision to life on a much larger scale. The work that had once felt like a small, independent venture was now part of something much bigger. Frank and his team could now push the boundaries of what they had originally imagined. He watched with pride as Rachel, Clint, and the rest of the team worked tirelessly, bringing their ideas and innovations to life. Rachel had shifted into the role of Chief Operations Officer, managing the day-to-day decisions that kept the company moving forward. Clint, ever the strategist, had taken on the responsibility of coordinating efforts with their new investors and overseeing the global marketing push. But as the company grew, so did the complexity of their operations. Frank realized that they had reached a pivotal moment. Their invention, something that was once a solitary dream in his mind, was now poised to change industries. They had been offered international distribution opportunities, and the conversations were moving faster than he could keep up with. The media was all over their product. Frank was becoming a sought-after figure, with interviews on news outlets and podcasts, speaking about the need for sustainable energy alternatives and how his invention could help mitigate the environmental crises facing the planet. But the constant barrage of requests and expectations started to take its toll. One night, after a particularly grueling day of meetings, Frank found himself sitting alone in his office, his eyes fixed on the view of the city outside. The lights below twinkled, but in the quiet, he could hear the weight of everything pressing down on him. Rachel knocked softly and stepped into the office. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but with a concern that Frank couldn't ignore. Frank looked up and offered a tired smile. "I'm fine. Just, trying to wrap my head around everything. It's a lot, you know." Rachel nodded. I get it. Things are moving fast. But you've built something incredible here, Frank. And you're not doing it alone. You've got the team, you've got us. I know, he said, his voice trailing off. But sometimes it feels like I'm the only one holding everything together. We've reached a point where one wrong move could undo everything. And I can't let that happen. Not now. Rachel pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. Look, I know it's scary. But think about how far we've come. When we started, we didn't even have a prototype. Now, we've got the backing, the team, and the momentum. You've always known this was bigger than just one person. It's about all of us, working together. Don't forget that. Frank nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He had always been driven by his vision, but he had never anticipated how much of a collective effort it would take to make that vision a reality. The company had become a family, and it wasn't just his dream anymore. It was theirs too. As the weeks went by, Frank began to delegate more, trusting his team to take on key decisions. He had to, for the sake of his own sanity. He spent more time refining the long-term strategy and focusing on the larger picture, while Rachel and Clint handled the operations. The team had grown, and so had the challenges. They had more international partners, more suppliers, and more complex logistics to manage. Every day brought new hurdles to jump over, but Frank found solace in the fact that they were moving forward together, with purpose and determination. The real breakthrough came when the company secured a major partnership with a renewable energy giant in Europe. This partnership wasn't just about distribution, it was about integrating Frank's technology into existing infrastructure, something that had once seemed impossible. The deal would allow them to reach a much wider market and solidify their position in the industry. The news spread like wildfire. Frank's company was now a major player in the renewable energy space, and the world was taking notice. The media dubbed it the New Green Revolution, and Frank found himself at the center of the conversation, not just as a founder, but as an advocate for a brighter, more sustainable future. But as the recognition grew, so did the scrutiny. There were whispers in the industry, rumors about competitors trying to undermine their success. Some even accused Frank's company of making promises it couldn't keep, claiming that their technology wasn't as revolutionary as it seemed. One particularly scathing article came from a well-known industry publication. The headline read, "Is Frank's invention just another greenwash?" The piece criticized the company for exaggerating the capabilities of their technology and questioned the long-term sustainability of their practices. Frank's stomach turned when he read the article. He had expected criticism, it was inevitable when you were making waves in such a competitive industry. But this felt personal. The accusation that he was misleading the public about his invention struck a nerve. He had worked tirelessly to build something real, something that could truly make a difference. The thought of being accused of deception made him feel sick. Rachel immediately called a team meeting to address the issue. Clint suggested they draft a public response, emphasizing their commitment to transparency and the scientific validation behind their technology. But Frank wasn't sure if a response would be enough. The article had already gone viral, and the damage was done. "We need to double down on what we're doing," Frank said, his voice steady but firm. "We've built something that works. We don't need to explain ourselves to anyone. We just need to keep moving forward, no matter what they say." Rachel and Clint exchanged glances. They knew how much this hurt Frank, but they also knew he was right. The only way forward was to prove the naysayers wrong, by continuing to innovate, by continuing to push for change. The wind seemed to be at Frank's back for the moment. The company was growing steadily, and their reputation was only strengthening with each new milestone. With the partnership in Europe now fully operational, production was ramping up, and Frank had never felt so proud. The new technology was being deployed in real-world scenarios, with notable results. The shift towards a greener, more sustainable energy future was no longer a distant dream, it was happening, right here, right now. But as much as things seemed to be going well on the surface, Frank couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. He had been in this position before, where everything seemed to align perfectly only for a sudden storm to hit out of nowhere. And in this industry, a storm wasn't just a bad quarter, it could mean the end of everything. The pressure to deliver was mounting, and he could feel it in every interaction. His inbox was flooded with requests for interviews, proposals, and meeting invitations. Journalists from around the world wanted his opinion on everything from policy changes to innovations in renewable energy. While it was gratifying to be at the forefront of such an important movement, Frank found it overwhelming. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Frank sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had a dozen unread emails, a voicemail from an investor, and a reminder for another press conference. He felt a strange sense of disconnect, as if he was looking at someone else's life, a life that he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from Clint. "We need to talk. Urgent. Meet me at the office in an hour." Frank immediately felt his heart rate spike. Clint never texted with that level of urgency unless something serious was happening. He quickly grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, the weight of anticipation hanging heavily in the air. When Frank arrived at the office, he found Clint already waiting in the conference room, his expression tense. The flickering fluorescent lights above added to the unease in the room. Rachel was on a video call with their European partner, discussing the logistics of the next phase of their rollout. Clint gestured for Frank to sit down, and as soon as the call ended, he wasted no time. "I'm hearing disturbing news," Clint began, his voice grave. "There's a leak in the system." Frank furrowed his brow, trying to process the meaning of Clint's words. "A leak? What kind of leak?" "A breach," Clint clarified, "of confidential information. Someone has access to our proprietary designs, our research, everything. And they're leaking it to a competitor." Frank's pulse quickened. The significance of the news hit him like a ton of bricks. The intellectual property they had worked so hard to develop, this was the very core of their company. If a competitor got hold of that, they could replicate the technology and undercut everything they had worked for. "Who's behind it?" Frank asked, his mind racing. "We're still trying to trace it," Clint said, running a hand through his hair. "But it's bad, Frank. We're talking about sensitive, top-tier stuff. If we can't control the damage, we'll be behind in a matter of weeks." Frank stood up, pacing the room. He could feel the walls closing in. His mind was working overtime, trying to formulate a plan. A breach like this could destroy everything they had built. Not only would they lose their competitive edge, but the public perception of their ability to protect their intellectual property would suffer irreparable damage. Investors would pull out, competitors would swoop in, it would be a catastrophe. "Clint, what do we do?" Frank asked, his voice tight with concern. "We need to act fast." "I've already reached out to our legal team," Clint replied. "We're going to need a thorough investigation to find the source. In the meantime, we need to tighten up our security measures, go on the offensive. But this is going to take time. And we might have to go public about it, which could do more harm than good." Frank could hear the frustration in Clint's voice. He didn't have an easy solution, and neither did Frank. But they were in this together. And together, they would find a way to protect what they had worked so hard for. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and strategy sessions. Frank felt like he was constantly in crisis mode, trying to stay ahead of the curve while dealing with the fallout from the breach. Their legal team had started an internal investigation, but there were no clear answers yet. The breach had been carefully executed, no one could pinpoint the exact source. Meanwhile, the media was starting to pick up on the story. An anonymous tip had made its way into the hands of a reporter, and soon the leaks were public knowledge. The headline read, "Green Tech Startup in Crisis, Leaked Designs Could Change the Industry Forever." As soon as the article went live, it sent shockwaves through the business world. Frank's heart sank as he saw the backlash starting to unfold. In the following days, the rumors and suspicions grew louder. Competitors were capitalizing on the story, using it to undermine the company's credibility. Even some of their loyal partners began to question whether they had made the right investment. Frank knew that the longer they kept quiet about the situation, the worse it would get. The time for damage control had arrived. "We need to address this publicly," Frank said to Clint and Rachel in a tense meeting. "We can't let the speculation run wild. We need to own this before it spirals out of control." Rachel, who had been quietly observing Frank's escalating tension, finally spoke up. "I agree. If we stay silent, we look guilty. But if we're transparent about what's happened, show that we're taking steps to fix it, we can regain the public's trust." Clint nodded in agreement. "It won't be easy, but we've got to control the narrative. We can't afford to lose what we've built." Frank stood up and walked toward the window. The weight of the decision settled on him. His mind flashed back to the early days of the company when they had nothing but an idea and a dream. Now, that dream was at risk of being ripped away in an instant. "Let's do it," Frank said quietly, his voice firm. "We'll take the hit, and we'll come out stronger for it. But we have to move fast." The next day, Frank stood before the cameras at a press conference, surrounded by his leadership team. He took a deep breath before stepping up to the microphone. "I won't sugarcoat it. We've had a breach. Sensitive information has been leaked, and we're investigating it thoroughly," Frank said, his voice steady, but the weight of the situation clear in his eyes. "But I want to be clear about one thing: we will not let this define us. We are a company built on integrity and innovation. We're taking immediate action to secure our systems and protect our intellectual property. And we will continue to lead the charge for a sustainable future, no matter the challenges we face." As Frank finished his statement, the room was silent for a moment. The media had questions, of course, but for once, Frank didn't feel the weight of their scrutiny. He had faced the storm head-on, and now it was time to weather it together. The storm had arrived, but Frank was ready to face it. The days following the press conference were some of the hardest Frank had ever endured. The initial wave of media attention, while necessary, had done little to stem the tide of doubt and suspicion surrounding his company. Investors were skittish, competitors were emboldened, and customers who had once hailed the technology as revolutionary now hesitated. But Frank wasn't one to back down. He could feel the weight of the world pressing on him, on his team, on the future of the company, on the promise they had made to the world. He could hear the whispers in the halls of the office, feel the nerves running through the air. The atmosphere had shifted from optimism to uncertainty, and even though he tried to maintain a calm exterior, Frank was just as shaken as everyone else. He couldn't let this leak, this betrayal, undo everything they had worked for. There was too much at stake. The renewable energy movement was in its infancy, and their technology could change everything, if they could get through this. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, frantic meetings, and constant updates from the legal team. The breach was deeper than they initially realized. They were still working to pinpoint the source, but every new discovery seemed to make the situation worse. Someone within their company had to be responsible for leaking their designs, someone who had access to the highest levels of information. Frank could barely fathom the betrayal. It was a familiar feeling. Betrayal was something Frank had faced before in his life, and it always left a bitter taste in his mouth. As a young entrepreneur, he had learned the hard way that loyalty in business was a rare commodity. His experience had taught him to trust only a select few. Now, that trust was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, Rachel and Clint joined him in his office, both looking exhausted but determined. Clint had just returned from a meeting with their European partners, who had made it clear they were losing confidence in the company's ability to secure its technology. The pressure was mounting, and Frank knew they couldn't afford to lose this deal. "Frank," Rachel said softly, breaking the silence, we need to focus on regaining trust. It's the only way we're going to survive this. Frank rubbed his eyes, tired from a full day of calls and emails. I know. But how? How do we get people to believe in us again when they think we're vulnerable? When they think we can't protect our own work? Rachel leaned forward. We can't control what's already happened. But we can control what happens next. We need to show our investors, our partners, and the public that we're not backing down. We need to prove that this setback won't stop us from doing what we've set out to do. We'll beef up our security, yes, but we'll also double down on our mission. Let them know we're stronger than they think. Clint nodded. We can't afford to let this define us. We need a clear strategy to get back on track. It's time to be bold. Frank was silent for a moment, reflecting on Rachel's words. He knew she was right. They had no choice but to press forward. They had worked too hard for too long to let this be the thing that brought them down. I'll address the team tomorrow, Frank finally said, determination returning to his voice. We'll lay out our plan to move forward. We'll rebuild, together. And we'll make sure we're better than we were before. The next morning, Frank stood in front of the entire company, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen the looks in their eyes, the fear, the doubt. They were all wondering the same thing, what now? Everyone, I know things have been tough lately, Frank began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. We've faced a setback. There's no denying it. But we've also come too far to let this derail us. Our mission hasn't changed. The work we're doing still matters. And we will get through this. He paused, scanning the faces in the room. We're going to do what we've always done, adapt. We're going to strengthen our security, yes. But more importantly, we're going to keep pushing forward. We will not let this define us. We will prove that our technology is solid, our vision is clear, and our commitment to sustainability is unwavering. The room was quiet, the weight of his words settling in. Frank could see the glimmer of hope returning to their eyes. They were behind him, they always had been. We're in this together, Frank continued. And together, we're going to show the world that we are more than just a company. We are a movement. And we will not be stopped. In the weeks that followed, Frank and his team worked tirelessly to implement the changes they had promised. The legal team continued to investigate the breach, narrowing down their list of suspects. They were also working with cybersecurity experts to implement tighter security measures and prevent any future leaks. Meanwhile, Rachel and Clint spearheaded an aggressive PR campaign to restore their image. The company began releasing detailed reports on their technology, showcasing the security measures they had put in place, and highlighting their continued commitment to transparency. They emphasized their dedication to renewable energy and the long-term impact their work would have on the planet. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Every meeting, every phone call, and every interview was a chance to reaffirm their credibility and rebuild the trust they had lost. And slowly, bit by bit, the tide began to turn. Despite the challenges, Frank found himself reinvigorated. The company was starting to regain its footing, and the team was more united than ever. There was a renewed sense of purpose in the air. The crisis had brought them closer together, and they were emerging from it stronger, more focused, and more committed than before. But the storm wasn't over. Not yet. One day, as Frank was reviewing the latest reports, Clint walked into his office, a rare smile on his face. He had been working late the night before, following up on some leads from the internal investigation. I think we've got our culprit, Clint said, his voice low but filled with satisfaction. Frank's heart skipped a beat. Who? Clint held up a file. It's someone on the inside. But not who we expected. It's someone with access to our highest level data. Someone who's been playing both sides. Frank felt his pulse quicken. The culprit was closer than he thought. But even though the investigation was far from over, the revelation brought a sense of clarity. They were going to uncover the truth, and once they did, they could finally start to put the pieces back together. And Frank was determined to make sure that future was theirs. Frank sat in his office, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. It had been a long week filled with frustrating dead ends and mounting stress, but now the breakthrough he had been waiting for was finally within reach. Clint's discovery had set a series of events into motion, and Frank could feel the tension rising as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He ran his fingers over the file Clint had handed him, flipping through the pages filled with email chains, phone records, and internal documents. The culprit, as Clint had hinted, was someone Frank would never have suspected. Mark Dawson. Mark was the chief technology officer, the one person who should have been the most loyal to their mission. Frank had worked closely with him over the years, discussing innovations and strategies, sharing ideas that would shape the future of the company. Mark had been there from the beginning, a key player in the development of their groundbreaking technology. But now, as Frank read through the evidence, everything became painfully clear. Mark had been feeding confidential data to a competitor, someone who had been looking to replicate their work. The betrayal cut deep, and Frank couldn't shake the feeling of personal failure. He had trusted Mark, perhaps too much. "This isn't just business, Clint," Frank said, his voice hoarse. "This is personal. I brought him in, gave him a platform. And he turned on us." Clint nodded gravely, his expression as hard as granite. "I know, Frank. But we can't dwell on that now. We have to act fast. If we confront him publicly, it could backfire, especially since we don't have the full picture yet. We need a strategy to handle this carefully." Frank leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The pressure was unbearable. Confronting Mark was inevitable, but how to do it? The truth had to come out, but Frank had always believed in handling things with integrity, not drama. The last thing he wanted was to create a media circus out of this. But Clint was right, this had to be dealt with swiftly. "I'll call a meeting with Mark," Frank finally decided. "We'll give him a chance to explain himself. But if he doesn't come clean, we'll take the next steps." The next morning, Mark walked into Frank's office, his usual confident demeanor intact. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. "Morning, Frank." "Clint," Mark greeted, his tone casual, almost too casual. Frank didn't return the greeting right away, choosing instead to lock eyes with Clint, who stood by the door, silently watching the exchange. "Mark, take a seat," Frank said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. Mark sat down, but Frank could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. He knew something wasn't right, but he wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. Frank wasted no time. He opened the file Clint had given him and placed it on the table in front of Mark. The documents spilled out, detailing the emails, the dates, and the transactions that pointed to Mark's involvement in the leak. "Mark," Frank began, his voice measured but firm. "We have evidence of you leaking confidential data to one of our competitors. We know everything. The emails, the transactions, the communications. You've been betraying the company and everything we stand for." Mark's face paled, and for the first time in years, Frank saw a crack in his veneer. The confident facade shattered, replaced by guilt and fear. I don't know what you're talking about," Mark stammered, his voice unsteady. "This isn't what it looks like." Frank didn't flinch. He had heard the excuses before, but this was different. He could see the guilt in Mark's eyes. "Don't lie to me, Mark. We have everything. The proof is in black and white. And now, you have one chance to tell me the truth." Mark's eyes darted around the room as though searching for a way out. But Frank knew there was no escape now. He could see the weight of his betrayal crushing him, and Frank couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't think anyone would notice. I thought I could get away with it. Frank's jaw tightened. Why, Mark? Why would you do this to us? Mark shook his head, his voice trembling. It's not that simple, Frank. I needed money. I needed security. I made some bad choices, but I never thought it would blow up like this. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could get out before anyone found out. Frank stood up from his desk, feeling a surge of anger, disappointment, and betrayal. He had always tried to see the best in people, to give second chances. But Mark had gone too far. You've damaged everything, Frank said coldly. You've jeopardized the work we've done. The future we've built together. Do you have any idea what this means for us? For the company? Mark's face fell. He had no response. The guilt was written all over him, and Frank knew there was no turning back. Clint stepped forward. We'll be handling this legally from here. You'll need to pack your things and leave the company immediately. Mark nodded numbly, his face a mix of shame and regret. He knew what was coming next. He stood up, collected his things in silence, and walked out of the office without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, Frank collapsed into his chair, his mind racing. The sense of betrayal still stung, but it was tempered by the relief that the truth was out. Mark's actions had threatened everything they had worked for, but now they had a chance to rebuild. We'll get through this, Clint said, his voice quiet but resolute. I know, Frank replied, staring at the empty chair across from him. But it's going to take time. We have a long road ahead. Over the next few weeks, Frank focused on the immediate aftermath. He held meetings with their partners, reassuring them that the company was taking the necessary steps to protect its intellectual property. He also began planning the next phase of their recovery, reinforcing their security systems, rebuilding trust, and ensuring that their technology would remain protected. Meanwhile, Clint and Rachel worked behind the scenes, monitoring the media's coverage and working with legal teams to handle any fallout from Mark's departure. It wasn't easy, but they were making progress. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The company regained some of its lost ground as more and more clients and investors realized that the breach hadn't shaken Frank's commitment to innovation. The focus returned to their groundbreaking work, and slowly, the media's narrative shifted from scandal to solutions. Frank knew they had weathered the worst of the storm, but the damage had been done. Trust had been broken. And even though they were on the path to recovery, the scars from this betrayal would linger for a long time. The company would survive. But it would never be the same. And as Frank looked out of his office window, watching the city below, he couldn't help but wonder, what would the future hold? Would they truly emerge stronger, or would the shadow of this betrayal forever haunt them? Only time would tell. But one thing was for certain, they weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. With Mark gone, a somber silence had fallen over the office. The tension that once suffused every conversation had given way to an eerie calm. Frank sat at his desk, watching the steady flow of work around him, but his mind was elsewhere. The betrayal of someone he trusted so deeply left him haunted. He had always prided himself on seeing the good in people, on building a company based on trust and integrity. Now, that foundation felt cracked, fragile. Despite the internal challenges, the world outside was still watching. Investors, journalists, and competitors alike were all waiting for the company's next move. Everyone was curious to see if the scandal would be the end or the beginning of something new. Frank knew they had to act fast, but this time, he needed to be cautious. Rachel and Clint were busy working the media channels, ensuring their message remained focused on the future, not the past. Their plan was clear: show the world that the company was more than just a victim of betrayal. They needed to prove that the strength of their technology, the power of their vision, was what mattered most. Frank, we've got a situation, Clint's voice broke through Frank's reverie. Frank glanced up from his laptop to see Clint standing in the doorway, his expression serious. "What's going on?" Frank asked, his brow furrowing. He hadn't heard Clint sound this urgent in weeks. "Another leak," Clint said, his eyes narrowing. "It's not from inside the company, but someone's clearly trying to exploit the chaos from Mark's departure. Someone's going after our IP again." Frank's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, another leak? We've secured everything, haven't we?" Clint shook his head. "We thought we had. But it looks like someone's been poking around on the outside. It's been subtle, but we're seeing evidence that someone's trying to reverse engineer our product. They're targeting the exact technology Mark had access to. This could be bigger than we thought." Frank's pulse quickened. The last thing they needed was another attack on their work, another breach of trust. "What's the next move?" "We need to go on the offensive," Clint said. "We can't sit back and hope they go away. We'll have to go public with it." Rachel, who had been sitting at her desk, overheard the conversation and joined them. "We'll need a new strategy for this. We can't let them control the narrative. If we let this slide, it's going to undermine everything we've worked for. But we also have to be careful how we position ourselves. If we come across as too reactive, it'll seem like we're panicking." Frank thought for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities. "Let's control the narrative. We've been on the defensive long enough. It's time to take the fight to them." The following day, Frank called an emergency meeting with their top security and legal teams. They were all gathered in the conference room, where the mood was tense. This wasn't just a legal issue anymore. It was a full-blown crisis. "We've been under attack," Frank began, his tone firm. "And we need to make sure it ends here. This isn't just about protecting our technology anymore. It's about our reputation, our future, and our commitment to the work we're doing." The legal team had already begun drafting a statement, but Rachel wanted to take a more proactive approach. "We can't just issue a statement and hope it works. We need to show that we're fighting back. We need to demonstrate that we're not afraid to confront this head-on." Frank agreed. "We'll go public with the issue. We'll make it clear that we're aware of the threats, and we're taking action. But we'll do it on our terms, not theirs. No one else gets to tell our story." Clint had already briefed the security team on their next steps. "We'll need to bring in experts," he said. "We'll secure every line of communication. We'll strengthen our firewalls and go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. But we also need to get the word out to our clients, let them know we're ahead of this. We're not letting anyone steal from us." Rachel nodded. "Exactly. We have to show that we're taking every possible measure to protect our intellectual property. And at the same time, we need to regain the confidence of our investors and partners. We need to make sure they understand that we're still the best option for the future." Over the next few days, the company took aggressive action. They initiated a full security audit, bringing in outside experts to investigate every aspect of their operations. They updated their encryption systems and even began tracking who accessed their files in real time. It was a bold move, one that showcased their commitment to protecting their work. Frank hoped that the swift action would be enough to silence the whispers and restore confidence in their ability to secure their technology. But Frank also knew that this wouldn't be enough on its own. The public perception needed to shift. The media had been quick to jump on the company's struggles, but they hadn't focused on their resilience, their innovation, or the depth of their commitment to sustainability. That needed to change. Rachel drafted a message that Frank could share with the public. The statement would address the current crisis and reassure their clients and stakeholders that the company was taking steps to protect their future. But it would also include a promise, one that could not be broken. "We will not let this setback define us. We are still here, and we are still fighting for the future of renewable energy. We are committed to making this world a better place. And no one, no matter how hard they try, can take that from us." The message was a powerful one. It resonated with the public and the press, showing that Frank and his team were resilient, determined, and focused on their mission. The narrative was beginning to shift. Days turned into weeks, and the battle for the company's future intensified. Each day brought new challenges, new threats, but also new opportunities. Frank had always known that this journey wouldn't be easy. He had known there would be obstacles. But now, more than ever, he believed in the strength of their vision, the power of their technology, and the integrity of his team. As Frank walked through the office one evening, he saw the spark in the eyes of his colleagues. They were no longer just working for a paycheck. They were working for something bigger, something that could change the world. And in that moment, Frank knew that no matter what came next, they would survive. The storm wasn't over yet. There would be more battles to fight, more threats to face. But Frank was ready. He had weathered storms before, and he would do it again. Together, they would rise above it all. The days following their announcement were filled with a renewed sense of urgency. The media was still buzzing with speculation, but now, Frank and his team had a plan in place. They had to protect what they had left and ensure that no more damage was done. There was no time to waste, every move had to be strategic. Clint had been working around the clock with their security experts, ensuring that their defenses were as strong as possible. Rachel, always the media strategist, continued to manage the company's narrative. But for Frank, there was an ever-present undercurrent of dread. The threats they were facing weren't over. If anything, they were escalating. One evening, as Frank was heading home after a long day at the office, he received a message from Clint. "We've found something. Meet me at the office. Now." Frank's heart skipped a beat. Whatever Clint had uncovered couldn't wait until the morning. He turned the car around and headed straight back to the office, every inch of his body tense with anticipation. When Frank entered the office, Clint was already there, hunched over a laptop, his eyes scanning the screen with a look of quiet intensity. "Clint," Frank said, his voice low. "What is it?" Clint didn't look up immediately but gestured for Frank to come closer. The screen was filled with a series of encrypted files, each one containing complex data that Frank couldn't immediately make sense of. "Tell me what I'm looking at here," Frank said. Clint zoomed in on one of the files and began typing commands into the keyboard. A few moments later, the file decrypted, revealing a set of coordinates and time stamps. "This is the pattern we've been tracking," Clint said. "It's not just random attempts at breaching our security anymore. Someone's trying to pinpoint the exact location of our servers." Frank's stomach dropped. "Who's doing this? And why?" Clint shook his head. "I don't know yet. But these coordinates, they lead to a remote location in the middle of nowhere. It's highly suspicious." Frank felt a wave of anxiety flood over him. "Are we sure this is connected to the leak? It could be a coincidence." "No," Clint replied, his voice firm. "It's too precise to be anything other than deliberate. This is someone who knows exactly what they're doing. And they're getting closer." Frank's mind raced. This wasn't just a corporate espionage issue anymore. Someone was targeting them directly, and the stakes were higher than ever. "What do we do?" Frank asked, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. "We need to act quickly," Clint said, his eyes never leaving the screen. "If we don't shut this down now, they could infiltrate our servers and wipe everything out. We'll lose everything. This isn't just about theft anymore. It's sabotage." Frank took a deep breath. He had to think clearly. "What's the plan?" Clint hesitated for a moment. "I think it's time to play offense. We need to find out who's behind this before they get to our data. If we can get ahead of them, we might be able to stop this before it goes any further." Frank nodded, his mind already calculating the risks. He didn't have much time to make a decision, but he knew one thing: they couldn't afford to wait. The team was quickly mobilized. Clint and his security experts worked to trace the origins of the encrypted files, while Rachel began preparing a public statement to ensure their investors remained confident. Frank, meanwhile, had reached out to some of his most trusted contacts in the intelligence community, hoping they could provide some insight into the growing threat. Hours turned into days as the investigation unfolded. They had made progress, but it wasn't enough. The closer they got to identifying the source, the more dangerous things became. Whoever was behind this was covering their tracks with military precision. Frank began to wonder if they were dealing with something much bigger than just a corporate rival. Then, late one night, Clint called him with news that made Frank's blood run cold. "Frank, we've got a hit," Clint said over the phone, his voice taut with urgency. "We traced the location, and it's not just a remote outpost. It's a Black Ops facility. It's not even supposed to be on the map." Frank's mind spun as he processed the information. A Black Ops facility? What are we talking about here, Clint? Are we dealing with government interference? "I don't know," Clint replied. "But it's bad. Whoever's behind this has serious resources. This isn't just corporate sabotage. We're up against something far more dangerous than we thought." Frank felt his heart rate increase. He had always known that the stakes were high, but this was an entirely new level of danger. He didn't know if it was a government agency, a rogue corporation, or something else entirely, but he knew one thing for certain: they were now in a race against time. "We need to figure out who's pulling the strings," Frank said, pacing in his office. "We can't let this go any further." The next morning, Frank and Clint met with Rachel to discuss their next steps. There was a sense of urgency now, a quiet tension hanging in the air. The clock was ticking, and they needed to act fast. "We need to go public," Rachel said, her voice resolute. "We can't let them control this narrative anymore. If we reveal what we know, if we show the world that we're taking action, it'll force their hand. We need to send a message." Frank nodded, considering her suggestion. "You're right. But we have to be careful. We don't know exactly who we're dealing with yet. We don't want to provoke them." Clint interjected. "It's a gamble. But it's our best shot. If we stay silent, they could destroy us from the inside out. If we act now, we might be able to stay ahead of them." After a tense pause, Frank made up his mind. "Let's do it. But we need to be smart. We need to expose the situation without giving away too much. We'll make it clear that we're aware of the threat and taking steps to protect ourselves." The press conference was set for the following day, and Frank's stomach churned with nerves. This was the most critical moment of his career. If they played their cards wrong, everything could collapse. But if they played it right, they could expose the enemy and regain control. As the cameras flashed and reporters scribbled down notes, Frank took a deep breath and stepped to the podium. His voice was steady, despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. "We've always prided ourselves on our integrity, our commitment to innovation, and our dedication to creating something meaningful," Frank began. "But over the last few weeks, we've faced unprecedented challenges. Our security has been compromised, and we've discovered that there are powerful forces trying to undermine everything we've worked for. These forces are not just corporate rivals. They have the resources to operate in the shadows, and they'll stop at nothing to destroy us." The room fell silent, the weight of Frank's words sinking in. "We're taking every step necessary to protect our technology, our future, and our people. We will not be intimidated. We will not be silenced. We will continue to fight for what we believe in, no matter who's standing in our way." The room erupted into questions, but Frank's words had already done the job. The company was now on the offensive, and there was no turning back. In the days following the press conference, Frank felt like he was walking a tightrope. The company had gained a temporary boost in confidence from their public stance, but there was still so much at stake. The response from the media had been mixed. Some praised their bold move, while others questioned whether they had bitten off more than they could chew. But Frank couldn't afford to dwell on the noise. The threat was still very real, and they were in a race against time to uncover the identity of their adversaries before it was too late. Inside the company, things had become increasingly tense. The employees, who had once been unified in their ambition and drive, were now divided. Fear hung in the air. Frank had always been able to count on the loyalty of his team, but as the pressure mounted, some began to look over their shoulders. Was there a traitor in their midst? Who could they trust? The security team, led by Clint, had become more vigilant. They were running frequent checks, monitoring every employee's movements and actions, but nothing concrete had emerged. Frank could tell that Clint was growing more restless by the day. Every lead seemed to fizzle out, and every investigation into potential threats brought them back to square one. It was as if they were chasing shadows. The strain was evident in Rachel as well. She had been working tirelessly to keep up the company's image and control the narrative, but she was beginning to burn out. Frank had seen the way she rubbed her temples after every media call, how her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she was trying to hide. But Rachel never showed weakness. She was determined to protect what they had built, even if it meant pushing herself beyond her limits. One night, after an exhausting day of meetings, Frank found himself alone in the office long after everyone else had gone home. He stared at the glowing screen of his computer, watching the influx of emails and messages coming in faster than he could process. There was an unease deep in his gut that he couldn't shake. The longer they spent chasing leads without results, the more it felt like they were missing something vital. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Clint. "I've got something. It's big. Come to my office." Frank's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped for a breakthrough, but now, the possibility felt like both a relief and a heavy burden. He grabbed his coat and headed for Clint's office. When Frank entered, Clint was pacing back and forth, his expression tight with intensity. "I think we've found something," Clint said without wasting time. "It's not much, but it's something. I've been looking into the patterns of communication, tracking encrypted messages, and I found something strange. The origin points of the leaks. They're not from just one place. They're from multiple locations, but they're all linked to an offshore network. It's a web of connections, Frank. And it's big." Frank's mind was racing. Offshore network? What does that mean? It means that whoever's behind this has resources. They've created a decentralized system to hide their tracks. These are professional hackers, Frank. But it gets worse. Frank frowned. Worse? How? Clint leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. I dug deeper. One of the linked locations is a shell company tied to a government contractor. They specialize in cybersecurity and military-grade tech. But here's the kicker, this company is tied to a powerful group of individuals. People who operate in the shadows. If we're right, we're dealing with far more than corporate sabotage. This could be a covert operation. Frank's stomach turned. He had been right all along. This wasn't just about technology. This was about power, about someone using their influence to destroy everything they had worked for. Do we know who they are? Frank asked, his voice quiet but full of resolve. Clint shook his head. Not yet. But we're getting closer. This is a dangerous game we're playing, Frank. If they find out that we know, they won't hesitate to go after us harder. We're not just fighting for our company anymore. We're fighting against people who have everything to lose if we succeed. Frank's pulse quickened. He had always known that this battle was more than just about protecting intellectual property. But now, it was clear, they were up against something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. We need to go public, Clint said. We can't let them control this. If they want to go after us, we need to make sure the world knows who they really are. Frank hesitated. Going public meant putting a massive target on their backs. But if they didn't take a stand now, they would be playing defense for the rest of their lives. "You're right," Frank said finally, his voice steady. "We'll tell the truth. But we need to be smart. We can't reveal everything. Not yet. If we make the wrong move, we might provoke them into escalating things faster than we can handle." Clint nodded. "Understood. We'll keep it tight, but we need to get ahead of them. We can't let them take control." The next day, Frank and Rachel met to discuss their strategy. It was clear that they had no choice but to act fast. But every decision now carried monumental risks. "We need to release a statement," Rachel said, her voice unwavering despite the uncertainty. "We'll go after the sources of these leaks without giving away too much. But we'll make it clear that we know who's behind this. We can't let them keep us in the dark." Frank looked at her, his mind whirling with all the implications. "If we do this, we need to have all our ducks in a row. No half measures. We need evidence." Rachel nodded. "I'll handle the messaging. You and Clint keep digging. We can't leave anything to chance." But even as they began to strategize, Frank felt a creeping dread. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. This wasn't just a battle for their company anymore. This was a battle for their survival. The days after their announcement were filled with tension. Frank's team, while galvanized by the public show of strength, still felt the pressure mounting with each passing hour. They were no longer just fighting for control of the company, they were fighting for their lives. And the shadows that had once been distant threats were now closing in. Clint and his security team had been working tirelessly to trace the origins of the cyber attacks. Every lead seemed to circle back to a dead end, yet Clint was relentless. He spent hours poring over data, finding anomalies, trying to piece together what had become an increasingly complex puzzle. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to manage the media, pushing out the narrative they had crafted with precision. The company's stock had remained stable, despite the recent leaks, and the public was beginning to see Frank's team as resilient. But even as the company held its ground in the media, Frank knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The real threat was hidden in plain sight. One evening, Clint called Frank to his office with urgency in his voice. "Frank, we've got a break," Clint said as Frank entered the room. His face was tense, eyes locked on the screen in front of him. Frank's heart skipped. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment they might finally discover who was behind the attacks. "Talk to me," Frank urged, walking over to Clint's desk. Clint hesitated before replying. "I ran a deep scan on the offshore network, and I found something. It's a group operating under the radar. A mercenary group, of sorts. But what's troubling is that this group has connections with several high-level government contractors. They've been in the business of handling classified data and cybersecurity for years." Frank felt his stomach drop. "So this is bigger than just a corporate rival. This is, military?" Clint nodded. "It's looking like it. And I don't think we're dealing with just one rogue actor. This could be a coordinated effort between private contractors and state-backed operatives." Frank stared at the screen, trying to process Clint's words. They had been right all along. This wasn't just a game of corporate espionage. Whoever was pulling the strings had resources beyond anything they could have imagined. This was a war, and they had been thrust into it without warning. "What do we do now?" Frank asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Clint's answer came quickly. "We need to expose this group. We have to go public, but this time with the full scope of what we've uncovered. We can't sit around waiting to be taken out. The only way we get ahead of them is by making them nervous. If they think they can intimidate us, they'll keep coming. But if we hit back hard enough, we might just have a chance." Frank was silent for a moment, weighing the risks. He knew that going public with such sensitive information could have disastrous consequences, but at this point, there was no turning back. They had to make a move before the enemy closed in completely. "We go public," Frank said at last, his voice firm. "But we do it carefully. We release enough to expose the network, but not so much that it puts us at risk. And we need to make sure that we have enough evidence to back everything up." Clint nodded. "Understood." The next day, as the clock ticked down to the moment of their announcement, Frank's heart raced. There was no turning back now. They had gathered everything they could, piecing together the connections between the shadowy mercenary group, government contractors, and the ongoing cyber attacks. Now it was time to expose the truth. Rachel was busy drafting the statement, careful to balance the gravity of the situation with the need to maintain control of the narrative. She knew that the public's perception would be crucial in the coming days. If they could show strength and resolve, they might just be able to turn the tide in their favor. "We've learned that the recent breaches against our company are part of a larger, coordinated attack," Frank began, his voice steady. "What we once believed to be a case of corporate sabotage is, in fact, much more sinister. Our investigation has revealed that these attacks are being orchestrated by a group with significant resources, including ties to high-level government contractors and private mercenaries." A murmur ran through the room as the reporters processed his words. Frank continued, determined to maintain control of the situation. "We will not be intimidated. We are committed to ensuring the safety and security of our technology, our people, and our future. We will continue to pursue every lead and uncover the individuals behind this attack. We will not stop until justice is served." Rachel, standing off to the side, watched the room carefully. She could see the reporters scribbling notes furiously, their minds already racing ahead to the implications of what Frank had just said. This was the moment that would define everything. But as the conference continued, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Somewhere in the crowd, behind the rows of reporters, he felt the presence of someone, something, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. There would be time for that later. That evening, as the press conference footage made its rounds online, Clint called Frank with urgent news. "Frank, you need to hear this," Clint said, his voice tight. "We've been compromised." Frank's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "We just traced the security breach to a new source," Clint replied. "It's not from any of the previous locations we identified. It's coming from within the company." Frank's blood ran cold. "A mole?" "I'm afraid so," Clint said. "Someone has been feeding information to the group. They've been inside our system, accessing confidential files. We need to act fast before they get away with everything." Frank's mind raced. They had been so focused on external threats that they had overlooked the possibility of betrayal within their own ranks. Now, the danger was even closer than they had imagined. "We're not safe anymore," Frank muttered under his breath. "Not even in our own office." The tension in the office was palpable the next morning. Clint and his team had already begun combing through the internal network, searching for any trace of the mole. Frank sat at his desk, his thoughts swirling. How had they missed this? And who among them could be the traitor? Rachel, looking weary but resolute, entered Frank's office with a grim expression. "We've got a problem. The leaks, there's something we missed. Whoever's behind this has a plan. They know exactly how to get under our skin." Frank stood, pacing the room. "We can't trust anyone. Not anymore." Rachel hesitated before speaking. "Frank, there's something else you should know. We might have a bigger enemy than we realized." Frank looked at her, waiting for her to explain. "This is bigger than just the leaks," she said, her voice low. "They're after more than just information. They're after control. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." The weight of her words sank in. Frank realized, with chilling clarity, that the fight wasn't just about protecting their company anymore. It was about something far darker. They were playing a game they hadn't fully understood, one where the rules were set by people who would stop at nothing to win. And Frank wasn't sure they could survive it. The weight of Rachel's words hung over Frank like a storm cloud, dark and threatening. They weren't just fighting a group of hackers or business rivals anymore. They were up against an invisible enemy who had power, influence, and the means to destroy everything they had built. The realization that they were caught in a much larger, more dangerous game was enough to shake anyone's resolve, but Frank wasn't just anyone. He couldn't afford to give in to fear. Not now. In the days following their public announcement, the atmosphere at the company had shifted. People were on edge. The internal mole was still at large, and Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched at every turn. There were no longer moments of peace, just constant tension, uncertainty, and a gnawing sense that the next step could be their last. Clint and his security team worked around the clock, tracing the mole's every movement, every login, every interaction. It wasn't long before they found something, a break in the system that, while subtle, was unmistakable. Whoever was leaking information was careful, covering their tracks, but Clint had become an expert at spotting these types of patterns. The mole's been using a shadow account, Clint explained, his voice tense as he briefed Frank. It's sophisticated, but not invincible. I've got a lead on their location. We're closing in, Frank. Frank nodded. It was the first good news he'd heard in days. They had a chance to strike back, to catch the person who had betrayed them. But even as Clint spoke, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a larger plan, one they had only begun to unravel. Later that evening, Frank found himself alone in his office once again, staring at the reports scattered across his desk. The pressure was overwhelming. Every decision felt like a matter of life or death. But there was one thing Frank had learned over the years: the hardest decisions were often the ones that mattered most. As he sifted through the information in front of him, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Clint. We've found the mole. It's someone close. We need to move fast. Frank's stomach tightened. He had suspected this for days. There was no way they could have missed it if it wasn't someone within their inner circle. He quickly responded. Where? The IT department. Jane Montgomery. She's been accessing files she shouldn't have been. We've confirmed it's her. Frank's pulse quickened. Jane Montgomery. She had been with the company for years. A trusted member of the team. But now, it seemed she had been playing a much darker game. When Frank arrived at the IT department, Clint and his team were already there, surrounding Jane's workstation. The woman herself was nowhere to be found, and Clint's grim expression told Frank all he needed to know. She's gone, Clint said, his voice low. It's like she knew we were onto her. She wiped everything, the hard drives, the backup servers. She knew how to cover her tracks. Frank stood there for a moment, digesting the news. Jane had been one of the most trusted employees. She was diligent, always a step ahead of the curve, and had been a key figure in keeping their systems running smoothly. The betrayal stung. But there was no time to mourn. They had to keep moving forward. Do we know where she went? Frank asked. Clint shook his head. Not yet. But we've got eyes on her. We'll find her. But we can't waste any more time. She's working for someone. Whoever's behind this, they're not going to stop until we're finished. That night, as the team worked tirelessly to track Jane's movements, Frank sat in his office, lost in thought. The pressure was suffocating. The public was watching, the internal threats were multiplying, and their resources were stretched thin. He could feel the walls closing in. But as the hours dragged on, one thing became clear: they were running out of time. The next morning, Clint called Frank with an update. We've located her. She's headed to a remote airfield about an hour outside the city. We believe she's meeting with someone, possibly the people behind this whole thing. Frank's mind raced. If Jane was meeting with the people responsible for the attacks, they had to move quickly. If they didn't stop her, she might escape with vital information that could bring them down for good. "Prepare the team," Frank said, his voice resolute. "We can't let her get away." At the airfield, the tension was palpable. Frank, Clint, and a small team of security personnel stood just outside the hangar, watching as Jane emerged from a sleek black SUV. She was talking to a tall, shadowy figure Frank couldn't quite make out. His instincts screamed that this was it, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. As Jane approached the plane, Clint signaled for the team to move in. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as they closed the distance. But just as they were about to make their move, something unexpected happened. Jane turned sharply, her eyes scanning the area before locking onto Frank's team. "It's a trap!" Clint shouted. The gunfire erupted in an instant. Frank ducked, instinctively pulling Clint down with him. The sound of bullets pinging off the metal hangar sent the group into a panic. They weren't prepared for this. Jane had known they would come. She had set them up. "Move! Get to cover!" Clint yelled, as he and the others scrambled to safety. Frank's mind was racing. This wasn't just an attack, it was a message. Whoever was behind this wasn't playing by the rules. They were playing for keeps. In the chaos, Frank saw Jane's figure disappearing into the shadows, moving toward the plane. The realization hit him like a freight train: if she got on that plane, they would lose everything. With Clint's team covering him, Frank bolted toward the plane. He could hear the engine starting to roar to life, and his heart sank. They were running out of time. As Frank reached the plane, he was met with a figure stepping into his path. A man, tall and imposing, dressed in a black tactical suit. Frank's blood ran cold as he recognized the face. "You," Frank spat, his voice a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You're the one behind this." The man smirked. "I wouldn't say that. Let's just say I'm the one who's making sure things go according to plan." Before Frank could react, the man pulled a gun, aiming it directly at him. Frank's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't the end. Not yet. But just as the man was about to pull the trigger, a shot rang out. The man collapsed to the ground, and Frank looked up to see Clint, standing with a smoking gun. "You okay?" Clint asked, his voice steady. Frank nodded, his mind still reeling from the close call. They had survived. For now. But they were still far from safe. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance as Clint and his team secured the perimeter of the hangar. Jane Montgomery, the traitor who had once been a trusted ally, was now in custody, but Frank knew that capturing her was only part of the story. The enemy they were up against had proven to be far more dangerous and far-reaching than they had anticipated. As Clint approached, his face hard and focused, Frank looked at him, trying to steady his thoughts. The battle was far from over, and this moment, this small victory, felt hollow when compared to the larger war they were still waging. The mole, Jane, might have been exposed, but the conspiracy was still very much alive. "We need answers," Frank said, his voice grim. Clint nodded. "And we'll get them from her. But there's one thing you need to know: whoever's behind this, they won't stop at just Jane. They'll make their next move. And if they think we've been compromised, they'll retaliate. We can't afford to relax." Frank took a deep breath. "Then we don't relax. Not now, not ever. We take the fight straight to them. They've been playing us for too long, hiding in the shadows, but they're about to step out into the light." Back at the office, Frank convened a meeting with Rachel, Clint, and the remaining members of his inner circle. He had a clear vision now, a plan that would expose the full extent of the conspiracy and bring it all crashing down, no matter the cost. "This is it," Frank began, his voice hard and determined. We've already made a splash by going public with what we know. But it's not enough. Jane's been feeding them information for months, and now we've got her. But this entire operation is too well organized. They've got too many layers. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes bright with purpose. We can't just keep throwing information out there. If we do, they'll be able to cover their tracks, disappear, and we'll lose our chance. Clint stepped in, his expression tense. Exactly. We need something concrete, proof that ties them directly to everything that's happened. Jane's confession will help, but it's not enough to take down the entire operation. Frank nodded. I've been thinking about that. The only way we're going to win this is to go after the heart of the operation. Whoever is orchestrating this is still in the shadows. We have to drag them out and make them show their hand. Rachel met Frank's gaze. But how do we get them to move? They're smart, smarter than us, probably. They won't act unless they think they're being threatened directly. Frank paused, considering the challenge ahead. It was a massive risk. But in moments like this, he knew that the biggest risks were the ones worth taking. We give them what they want. The plan was set in motion quickly. Frank's team staged an elaborate ruse, leaking carefully controlled information about their investigation, but with one key piece of misinformation. They made it look as though they were planning to release Jane's confession to the public, making it seem like they were about to reveal everything, names, dates, the full scale of the conspiracy. Rachel managed the media push, creating a frenzy around the supposed bombshell of Jane's full confession. The public was hungry for more, and the anticipation built quickly. They were going to think they had the upper hand. But behind the scenes, Clint's team had already set up a trap. They would send Jane's confession to a secure, encrypted channel, a channel only their enemies would have access to. The moment the transmission was received, they would have their enemies right where they wanted them. It didn't take long for the enemy to take the bait. Within hours of the release, Frank received the first confirmation: the encrypted transmission had been intercepted by their adversaries. They had taken the bait, and Frank knew that it was only a matter of time before they would make their next move. But Frank wasn't content with just a simple interception. He needed them to come to him, to show themselves. That was when he made the final move. "We need to set up a meeting," Frank said, his eyes sharp. "A direct confrontation. We know they're watching us. So let's make sure they see exactly what we're doing, and let's make it clear we're not afraid." The final confrontation took place in a high-end, secure location, a place that had been chosen specifically for its anonymity. Frank, Clint, and Rachel stood together, waiting. They had set up everything just as planned. Jane's confession, with all its tantalizing details, was sitting ready to be unveiled. The message was clear: come out and face us. As they waited, the tension in the air was nearly unbearable. Frank's pulse was steady, his thoughts clear. This was the moment where everything could go right, or terribly wrong. And then, the door opened. A man entered the room, his face covered in shadow. Frank's instincts screamed that this was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment when the enemy would finally reveal themselves. The man was tall, dressed in black, with a cold, calculating presence that seemed to fill the room with a sense of danger. Frank stood up slowly, his gaze locked onto the figure. "I've been waiting for you." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped into the light, revealing his face. Frank's heart skipped a beat. It was someone he knew, a familiar face that sent a chill down his spine. "Stephen," Frank said, his voice trembling with shock. You were behind this?" Stephen, a former colleague of Frank's, smirked. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you, Frank? I've been playing this game much longer than you have. And I have much bigger plans than you can possibly understand." Rachel's eyes widened as she looked between Frank and Stephen. She had heard the stories, but she hadn't known that Frank's old friend had been the mastermind behind it all. It was hard to believe. You've been orchestrating everything? Clint asked, his voice low and dangerous. The leaks, the attacks, the sabotage, it was all you. Stephen's smirk deepened. Everything, Clint. From the very beginning. You see, Frank, your company had something I wanted. And now, it's mine. Frank's mind raced, the weight of Stephen's words sinking in. This wasn't just about business, it was personal. Stephen had been playing them all for fools, manipulating them every step of the way. You're going to pay for this, Frank said, his voice hardening. All of it. Stephen laughed, the sound cold and mocking. You really think you can stop me now, Frank? You've exposed the truth, but you've only made me stronger. It's too late for you. But Frank wasn't finished. Maybe. But this is where it ends, Stephen. With a swift motion, Frank signaled Clint. In a blur, the room erupted in action. The authorities, who had been monitoring the meeting in secret, stormed in, surrounding Stephen and his men. It was over. The mastermind had been caught, and the conspiracy was finally unmasked. As the handcuffs clicked around Stephen's wrists, Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The battle had been long and brutal, but they had won. As the dust settled, Frank looked around the room at his team. They had survived the storm. But more importantly, they had exposed the truth, no matter how dark it was. Frank turned to Rachel and Clint, a small, victorious smile crossing his face. We made it. Rachel nodded, a look of satisfaction in her eyes. But we couldn't have done it without you, Frank. Clint added, it's over. But don't think for a second that it was easy. Frank looked out the window, his mind filled with the ghosts of everything they had fought for. It had been a journey of loss, betrayal, and ultimately, redemption. And while the future was still uncertain, Frank knew one thing for sure, they had come out on top. The game was over. And for the first time in a long while, Frank could finally breathe easy. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?